So a very good morning to everyone. I congratulate everyone who made it to the OOZE on a rainy morning, and good morning also to all of you at home. Congratulations, you made it. Thank you. So a very warm welcome to the 9th session of the lecture series, Territorial Design. A small auditorium this morning in the OOZE, and I guess a bigger one in Zoom. How many people are we welcoming this morning in Zoom, Nazlı?
About 50.
About 50. Okay, that's great. So we will inform you about the numbers soon. So thank you, Nazlı, for collaboration. Thank you, Kiana Zhu, also for making the time in the busy semester ending. And the 9th session and the 10th session are dedicated to energy. Today we will welcome Eva Pfannes, a colleague and collaborator, a principal of the office OOZE in Rotterdam, and also co-curator of the Rotterdam Biennale, and also a person, I think, with a very extraordinary practice of integrating, let's see, the problematic of resources, in particular water and energy, in urban design, a very much needed kind of I think a pioneering effort. So I think it will be a pleasure. But first, we will hear from Nazlı a few words about the energy program in this lecture series. Then Nazlı will also tell us a few more details about Eva and her career. We will then hear from Eva, and finally, the finale you're all waiting for, the third exercise. So I wish you a great time, and also we hope to you know, have time for discussion and exchange with Eva after the talk. So wishing you a good session.
Okay, so good morning again, everyone. Thanks for all being here, and also to Eva. So you know now that each year we have within our lecture series, Territorial Design, a particular theme that we focus on. And this year's theme is My Energy, which I guess the timing couldn't really be more appropriate. And within this theme, we have 4 guest speakers. We already had 2 of them, and today is our 3rd guest speaker, and they're engaged in fields ranging from energy humanities and feminist political ecology to urban history and urban design. And their talks approach notions such as energy transition, decarbonization, genealogy of energy, and urban microclimates. Today, we are very thrilled to have Eva Pfannes here, our 3rd guest lecturer who came all the way from Netherlands with a train. But before introducing her, I would again like to say a few words on our theme, My Energy. According to the first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed from one form to the other. This means it can be captured, and capturing various forms of energy in order to ensure a certain way of life that we are all used to now. It serves to some extent at the expense of others, which has been business as usual for a very long time. But this way of living, which we have been taking for granted, it was made possible through exploiting fossil fuels and treating the planet as a resource itself. And this illusory way of living, having ever more energy, cheap and inexhaustible, it was made kind of as an inherent thing to our existence, equivalent to a modern and normal life, to a free way of living. But today we know that this is not really the case. We are well aware of it, and we know that this is delusional. We are actually literally in the midst of a fossil fuel induced climate crisis interrelated with the pandemic and the ongoing geopolitical conflicts around the planet. Today, it is very clear to us that certain things are bound to change if we are to transcend the energy impasse that we are currently in. And now we are the most aware that we have ever been, that resources are actually finite because it literally affects our everyday lives. This is the slogan of the federal government, energy is scarce, let's not waste it. It's obvious that we must imagine alternative energy futures of post-oil, post-carbon, post-urban, and post-human. And in order to do that, we need to have epistemological and ontological changes within our habits, value systems, modes of living, and institutions. And we have to also ask ourselves, can we really tackle the energy crisis and make the energy transition if we as citizens follow these recommendations? Obviously, there is a big increase in the purchase of energy saving products. This article from Galaxus website, it shows us. And this is certainly not the case for only Switzerland. And we can, I guess, think that this obedience to the recommendations coupled with certain gadgets, it might help us get through this winter, but the question is what happens next? So considering all this, reimagining the relationship between energy and territory through a critical ecological design thinking becomes all the more crucial. Instead of continuing the power asymmetries and allowing capitalism to reinvent itself by finding new frontiers of extraction and inventing new techno fixes here and there, can the energy transition be radical and just? This is also what we ask in our design studio, Power to the People. Can architects and territorial designers envision a more democratic, equitable, and ecological landscape? Can we reconceptualize the idea of energy once again and collectively work to conceive energy as a public and planetary good that shapes the socio-ecological fabric of our territories? And this is why we are very excited to have Eva here, Eva Pfannes, whose body of work is directly interlinked with all these teams. Eva is an architect and urban designer. She is the co-founder of the international design practice OOZE and working across scales from regional strategies to architecture and research, combining an elaborate understanding of natural ecological processes with technological expertise and deep insights into the social, cultural behavior of users of the built environment. She was co-curator of the 9th edition of the International Architecture Biennial Rotterdam, Down to Earth, and the lead designer of the Atelier Rotterdam 3. She is also the team lead for City of 1,000 Tanks project in Chennai, part of the global Water as Leverage program of the Dutch government. Her work has been widely published and exhibited. And in her talk today, Eva will discuss the transition plan of the Netherlands, aiming to shift 1.5 million homes away from dependency on gas within the next decade. She will talk about the local energy action plan LEAP that aims to implement this energy transition at district level in the municipality of Rotterdam. And she asks, similarly to us, how do we literally leap from where we are now to where we need to be in the future? Emphasizing that the energy transition is a shared problem that should be addressed collaboratively and integrally. So now the floor is yours, Eva.
So good morning. Nice to see you here. Thank you so much, Milica, for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction, Nasli. So I'm going to talk about energy matters today. Energy matters. It's kind of can interpret it in many ways. It matters as a cause, as a theme, and as a subject. And so I will go through these various ideas in the lecture. As Nasli already said, now we have an energy crunch. We are in a crisis. Prices increase tenfold in no time. And that leads to, of course, saving measures, but it can also lead to rethink and to actually get into the theme and try to understand issues we took for granted before. So here you see basically what we talked about yesterday already. How is the price actually made for energy? How is the price defined? So we see here the situation in the Netherlands in 2020, 2 years ago, in the second quarter. So that's 26 terawatt. And we see 30% was coming from wind and sun of the electricity, 60 from gas, and 10 from coal. Now, we also see already that the wind and sun energy, we practically get it for free. We just need to build the instruments to capture it. We need to buy gas from different countries, which are mostly political debatable. And we have to buy the coal somewhere. And we have to, like we saw yesterday, we have to actually extract the coal, which also leaves scars in the neighborhoods and in the landscapes. Now we see coal, and that's how the system is set up. Coal, the West system, which is the most polluting, the most carbon emissions, is the most expensive. You can practically not make any profit from it. Then you see with gas, you can make some profit because you have to buy it. And with wind and solar, it's actually very attractive. Now, we go to the situation right now, the second quarter of 2022, suddenly we see a very big supplier of gas falls out. No gas from Russia anymore, it's very precarious. So suddenly the production costs for gas, to make electricity with gas, rise enormously. And suddenly we can make money again with coal. So coal becomes profitable, which is actually not what we wanted. Wind and sun make enormous profits, but we don't see anything of this because mostly people who are producing are the same people. It's in the hands of the same fossil fuel giants, mostly, which have brought us to this situation. So this also depends, we talked yesterday, of course, what to do with the profit, so I will come back to that later. And so this dates back, our way of dealing with this is to base everything on a system, an economic system of a circular flow, so businesses and households and market relations in between. What is remarkably absent from this model is nature. So everything we take from nature is actually, we get it practically, we just take it, basically. That's the extractivism. And externalities are not calculated in the system. So that has, of course, consequences, which when this model was set up, Earth had only 3 billion inhabitants. We now reached 8 billion. And while at the time you might argue it might have still worked, right now it definitely doesn't work anymore. So here are just some extracts from the book Capitalocene from Jason Moore. A new epoch, we are in the Anthropocene, the Industrial Revolution and the burning of fossil fuels driven by the anthropos, means us, the humanity. Society and nature are not only expressions of alienation, but instruments of it. And so we look back kind of in history, how come we dealing with nature in that way? Yesterday we also heard some aspects about that. When it really started to take up speed was in the Descartesian revolution, with Descartes bringing about the idea, I think, therefore I am, and the sort of dualism that got introduced as a tool of a mind-body separation. So the mind is kind of thinking, scientists, mostly white men. The body is the extension of things where women, children, vulnerable people and nature were put in the same box. So this modern concept of society as opposed to nature was kind of invented then. So we see that also in this amazing illustration of the mechanical duck. So the rise of capitalism, this became a hard and fast separation and organizing principle that basically served well to achieve the growth. And what we have to ask ourselves right now, and what we didn't ask ourselves then as a society, is what is the value actually of nature? And what scientists, or chief scientist Francis Bacon, he came up with the idea we have to torture nature's secrets out of her. So society should dominate nature. And this is kind of a paradigm we're still stuck in right now. And we have to try and see how we overcome this. He helped spur 4 major transformations. So the either or thinking, the binary thinking, rather than the networked thinking. So that's something I saw also coming back in the work yesterday, that it's kind of very difficult to think in a network, and that it's very easy to go one track only and exclude other things. And that's something, however difficult it is, we have to try to bridge. Linked to this is the essentialist conception of things rather than relational. So objects, we treat everything like an object. So we buy oil, oil is an object. It's not part of a network of processes, how to make this, what is necessary to make it, and how eventually to give it back in the same state. Like when we think about water, water is an object, but it's also a process. So then domination, we heard that, of nature through science as a social good. So also right now, scientists, the big tech basically comes up with solutions. We take that for granted. And an interesting aspect also about visualization is that the type of mapping led to colonial domination. So we can also rethink how we visualize things in this respect. Now, we also have economists, wonderful economists, Mariana Mazzucato, but also Kate Raworth, who designed the circular flow model, where nature is essentially part, it's an adapted from the Samuelson model, where nature is within and around. Now, the next question is, what is nature actually? And nature is also remarkably absent from science often, because the term is so undefined and can mean so many things. So nature, of course, generally we mean the sort of romantic vision as opposed to culture. So that would be the first definition, the whole of the material reality. In the sort of romantic, post-romantic philosophy, Rousseau. The second would be the whole universe as a whole. So that's sort of all nature. It's all encompassing. The third one, and that is the one I will talk about most, because that's the one we're referring to with our work, is the specific force at the core of life and change. So that means we understand nature as natural processes, and we understand us as human beings part of these processes, trying to analyze and understand them and see ourselves within these processes. And the last one is essentially the nature of things, so the essence of something. And so hence, we try to get away from this idea of a contained city, so a city that depends on the hinterlands, on its relationship with the hinterlands, to what you could call an isotropic city, a fractal and expandable model that incorporates natural processes within. So we could also make this analogy of metabolism of a human body that has all the organs placed outside to bring the organs back into the metabolism, into the body, or into the city, or into the locality where we're dealing with. We see this makes sense. It became very, very painfully visible now during the crisis, when suddenly one of these pipelines, a major pipeline, indeed got cut off. So we see the fragility of the system. It costs money, it's inefficient, it leads to a lot of transportation costs, and it's very fragile. So that brings me now to the LEAP, the Local Energy Action Plan, which is commissioned by the International Architecture Biennial Rotterdam. And we worked on that during 16 months, starting end of 2019. And then it sort of transformed into something of a desk study during COVID-19 crisis. This is not, in any case, not yet the model the Netherlands deals with the energy transition. I wish it were, we're working towards it, but there is a sort of different idea of where the government is heading right now with sort of big transformations and what is possible in the neighborhood where we as urban designers could participate. So essentially it means how can the energy transition be used as a leverage to build societal value in a specific neighborhood in Rotterdam. It's a neighborhood of 14,000 people. It's the second poorest neighborhood in the Netherlands. And it has a lot of young generation, a lot of immigration. It's a working neighborhood linked to the harbor. So the goal for the LEAP with a case study in this neighborhood is, of course, to become CO2 neutral in 2050, linked to the goals of the government and the Paris Agreement. But of course, it's also linked to the SDGs. So the agenda, so-called Agenda 2030, that talks about 17 goals on a societal level that need to be achieved, that all nations agreed with the UN to achieve until 2030. So the leap can be seen as a leap between where we are now with an average carbon footprint of around 16 tons per person to a carbon neutral neighborhood that gives us many, many benefits. So when we started this, also working with people in the neighborhoods, we first ask ourselves, what does it actually mean to become carbon neutral? If it means anything, if it's actually achievable at all. So we looked at, because that is the questions you will basically get from the people who are very, very suspicious about the term energy transition and who see it almost in a very negative way as something the government invents to make money, for instance. So our consumption pattern right now is around only 20%, we can say, in domestic energy. So what we talk about with this project directly only addresses a fifth. We have a quarter for material, a quarter for food, and a quarter for mobility, and some on the waste. So with this kind of explanation, we went with a team of anthropologists into the networks in the neighborhood, and we had workshops to listen, to actually listen what are their problems, and to also come with some sort of explanations and sharing, basically exchanging knowledge and sharing. And we saw that there was a great hunger for information, that people were actually really curious because it's something they hear about, it's something they want to engage with. And we, at the same time, we were able to really listen, to pick up many informations that before we were not aware about, and that when we want to do such a local energy transition, we actually need to take them into account. So this is relating to, for instance, waste, it's relating to health, it's relating to fungus, to badly built houses, to flooding, to youth having no place to go, and to people who simply want to be part of this transition. So that is also a preconception that because people are poor, they might not have time, or they might not want to have a say. And this is essentially not true. People want to think about their own future and play a part in it. So that led us to this diagram that's essentially explaining it's the footprint of the neighborhood. We had also before the Biennale gave some commissions to research the technical aspects of the energy transition. So we have systems. Then we actually had a research by the anthropologists, what are the networks we can link to? And now the question is, how can we superimpose the two and work with them together, integrated towards a leap? We then set up 5 principles. So essentially, I'm putting those now up front, but essentially they came out of the research after the 15 months. So, and I'm gonna go through them now in the presentation. So it means build up local capacity. So that capacity is, we have a global capacity, a planetary capacity of our ecosystems, all our Earth systems, and we link that capacity to the local one. We have to integrate systems with each other. So we have to integrate sort of the green-blue infrastructures with energy, with an idea of how we manage that. And we have to integrate systems also in time. We want to manage these commons, this new type of commons, as assets, and there is an urgency, so a countdown to 2030. Sorry, this is in Dutch, I forgot to exchange that slide. And the last one is to communicate. Here you see an integration of scales, an integration of systems that starts with the Paris Agreement. You have then the Dutch climate agreement. You have a policy on a provincial level. You have a policy on a city level, and eventually you have the neighborhood. So the neighborhood as a pilot or as a case study can be a very useful tool to also see in how is the feedback between the neighborhood where actually people live, where we can experience things, and the large scale, what we have to achieve on a large scale. This is one of the first 4 panels conceptual panels that we made for the architecture biennial. So this in reality is around 160 by 180 meters. So it's very, very large. And we see kind of a combination of the personal, a link, I should say, of the personal scale to the planetary scale through the neighborhood. And so the neighborhood becomes this expression where we can experience change, and as such, it becomes a leverage to start working, a very powerful leverage where we can start. Secondly, we then worked on the tools. So what tools, what kind of instruments do we have available as architects and urbanists, and how do we integrate them? So we address climate mitigation through energy. We address climate adaptation through blue-green infrastructure. And so the idea is that with these 2 new aspects, we generate a new type of commons that needs to be managed with a set of governance tools. And so now that is the second panel, where each one is sort of branching out and then linking back into the neighborhood to find specific locations. So the energy, you can have energy production on different type of scales. So we saw a lot of that yesterday. So the sun farm or geothermal energy on a very, very large scale. We have the aquathermal, we have offshore wind parks, and we have the off heat from waste burning incinerators. Then we have energy storage. And energy storage, we have the standard, we have batteries, we have, we can make hydrogen, and we can use hydrogen as an energy storage. Or we can have a so-called aquathermal storage that goes 200 meters into the ground, into the aquifer, where we can store this heat from the summer to take it back in the winter. And this is something we used very much. It's I don't know about Zurich, but in the Netherlands, this in certain regions works very well. Then we have energy exchange. So there we have new type of radiators, induction radiators. For instance, we have ventilation that wins back heat. And then we have management systems. So management systems work locally in so-called energy hubs, where we then place heat pumps, for instance. We have different type of grids. So the normal grid, the big grid, we have the district grid or the microgrid. And we have dashboards, which then actually show us what can be consumed and where we can link to with apps. And lastly, we have insulation. We have efficiency increase, also with sun shading, because cooling is essentially part. And cooling, that's where actually nature-based solutions, green-blue infrastructure becomes very interesting, because that helps us to save energy during the summer. In green neighborhoods, it's around 10 degrees cooler. And so here we have also, of course, biodiversity increase, food production, green facades, etc., composting. Part of this, we have the blue infrastructure. So that essentially means that we store the rainwater that is falling mostly now in winter, with the changing patterns, when we even don't need it so much. So we store that in suds so we can use it in summer. And then we have the different governance tools. So here it becomes very interesting, because we can use governance. At first, we can use us as cultural actors. We can produce campaigns, we can produce platforms, events, exhibitions, such as the biennial, but also an exhibition that you might do of your work, to communicate and to build up this capacity of a community to know what possibilities they have, because they can only want what they know exists. Secondly, we have, of course, governance. So that's top down. So governance policies make sure that it's the same for everybody. Oftentimes, people only take the effort to go through change if they forced to by one or the other policy that makes sure the competitors do the same. But policy can also function as a carrot to reward pioneers, for instance, early starters. And then we have organization models and new type of roles that are mapped out here. Roles for people, inhabitants in the neighborhood, and type of financing models. So here you can choose from different ideas. People can be owner even though they renter. They can become part of an energy cooperation, an ESCO, a local energy service company, and start up slowly to think about change, maybe some green change in the neighborhood, and through that form a community that then can be upscaling the ideas towards energy, which is more costly. So we then, in parallel somehow with developing this conceptual and theoretical framework, we worked on 4 case studies in the neighborhood of Bosbolder-Tussendijken. So now I'm just going to illustrate the case study 1. Together, they form a sort of zoom into various typologies, also different typologies that we find all over the Netherlands, and as such then become exemplary so that we can extrapolate information and learn from that. So that's the first one, a housing block along a canal, the Schie. Again, here, this was then one panel that was again very, very large, that shows a speculative scenario of what happens if we introduce those tools and start to design with them on a housing block level. And then we calculated with different engineers and specialists on what would that cost, what could we actually achieve, like what part of the roof can we actually tile, how much of the street can we lose to get rid of parking. So in that case, that was 50%. And how would it actually change the whole building? So then we found that we can achieve 100% electrification. We introduce here 2 of the sets of these heat ground storage. We introduce aquathermal as exchange, and we can make around 20% of the energy locally, and we reduce the energy demand by 55% through insulation measures, various insulation methods. And so that is then how it looks. You see here one of the garages spaces on the ground floor gets transformed into an energy hub. We also see that the aquathermal energy is becoming visible, as well as rainwater storage is becoming visible. Also, switching, so here you see the different type of elements, the aqua thermal idea. Then you see the different type of installations that are necessary, and new type of induction radiators that can also cool in summer. Rainwater storage. Here we also see the heat storage, heat cold storage gets an expression on street level. We also see that 50% of the neighborhood are now green. This is something we can achieve with the amount of rainwater, and that's where that's what it's about, capacity. So if we calculate how much rainwater actually falls on the neighborhood, we can make an estimation how many plants we could irrigate with that, and that's around 50% overall. And we can store 3 tons of carbon per year, which is basically nothing. So you can also see that the carbon storage within the city is something that it has the green in the city has many other benefits, but for carbon storage, it's by far not enough. It's even less than 1 person. And so here that just gives an insight into the different calculations, how we achieve these numbers, and that actually to make the numbers can be then a very powerful tool. It's kind of tedious, it takes a lot of work, but somehow if we want to be competitive with the big systems, we have to do that because we have to know what is achievable on the small scale. So we then compare the numbers for the different type of housing typologies, and we then able to draw conclusions as in how much does it cost to transform 1 flat? How much does it cost kind of per kilogram of CO2 reduction? So what is necessary perhaps to do first? And very importantly, not to leave that out of sight, what is the value that we generate? What is the value that we generate by such a system where we say we step out of the sort of growth system we're in right now? So if we go to another sort of system, would the neighborhood become so nice that it would be nice to do, even if we wouldn't have to go through this transition? So that was a feedback we got from one of the inhabitants. And so that is then the third conceptual visualization, where you see the neighborhood in the middle. It's a sort of cost-benefit analysis, we might say. We essentially combine, or we see what are the resources and what is quantitative, so something expressible in figures, and what are qualitative, so something linked to the SDG qualitative benefits. And that brings us also back to that visualization from the lecture poster about the capacity of the neighborhood to act as a local storage. So here we have basically all the resources that we have that we can and we have to harvest in the neighborhood. So heat, also sun, of course, light, PV cells, then wind, water, the environmental, but also social capacity that we have here present. And so with what you saw with those 4 case studies, and then zooming out, extrapolating this on a neighborhood level, we find that with these type of measures, we could actually, for the whole neighborhood, achieve 100% electrification. We could roughly get, I think it was roughly 50% produce of the electricity inside the neighborhood. That means we still are dependent on the grid with 50%, but I think that's a good thing to achieve. We can then produce 100% of the heat locally with the insulation, and we can reduce the carbon by 61%. Just for these 18%. And through this, we might then achieve a whole lot of other benefits. So that is then we're talking about jobs in the neighborhood. We're talking about we're talking about kind of realization, a change of consciousness. We're talking about a better cohesion in the neighborhood, people who actually work in associations and get together have a better mental health. That's something interestingly that's proven. People who now maybe on the edge of society get reintegrated and find a role. In Bosporus-Tussendijk, you have many so-called milieu coaches, environmental coaches, very, very local, that give packages to people and tell them how to insulate their house, how to insulate their radiators. And we, of course, contribute to a planetary well-being. In this sense, it's also interesting to look at where spendings of the government are done currently and how we can leverage then money that is actually spent in health and in, so that you see here in sort of the black ball, that's more than 200 billion. That's the Dutch Rijksbudget from 2019. So that's before COVID, essentially. So that budget on health and well-being is many, many times more than the budget that was invested in the energy transition or in climate adaptation. So the question is how, that's where actually time aspects and scale aspects become important, because how could we take some of that money? So let's say we see that money in the cultural sector is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. But if you insert yourself within the sort of dynamics of the thinking about these systems, you might be able to get budgets from elsewhere to execute work that eventually also has a cultural expression. And then the 4th panel, that is where we talk about the urgency, about the process, the LEAP process, a countdown. And here we look how we combine these different ideas over time to eventually reach the 5,000 neighborhoods that need to go through the energy transition, and how you can make small steps, for instance, greenify neighborhoods, which is a sort of idea that is easy to be agreed on, and how through that you build communities that then can take bigger decisions together. And so that is a sort of a timeline, not over 30 years, but over the next 8 years, of a gradual build-up of the social system, the energy system, and the blue-green system, hand in hand, working towards CO2 reduction. And now I'm going to say a little bit how we work, what is the methodology. And so that is essentially also working very much on a scale that people can understand, because essentially I believe the energy transition is not a technical problem, because all the technical aspects, we have them since many years, but it's essentially a social and cultural problem. So we need to also get everybody on board. So that's why this local level is so important, to then make case studies, so to really build prototypes, and then to extrapolate on the neighborhood to find a goal that can be made. So here, that's also something that came up yesterday. If we have a cross section, we have different type of interests that are sort of waiting to be expressed with energy and water as well. So under the ground, we have many pipelines that are owned by one company, but are used by other companies. So there you get a lot of vested interest. Then we have basically people who rent, people who own, and all those different interests basically have to be dealt with together on one table with a certain type of budget to make sure there is something in it for everybody. And then we could basically combine this and work on it on a neighborhood. In Bospolder-Tussendijken, there is, interestingly, and that was why it was chosen, many networks that are already busy with this. For instance, the Delfshaven Energie Cooperatie, and that is then a sort of picture on the horizon where we could see what that could lead to in the future, what is possible if we don't think in a either this or, but if we think in a and kind of way. So if we think like we combine different type of systems and we use the space that we have already built in the city, so space that is lost somehow for renaturalization, and we make the best use we can. And I'm sure the tools will be much better in the future. Solar panels might become more efficient so that this might be able to shift. So then this is just some impressions from the exhibition where we made a so-called energy agora. You also see portraits of the key people in the neighborhood that we talk to, that become sort of pioneers of this transition. And you also see we take basically with these 8 panels, we take only a third. We also show the plans of the municipality of Rotterdam, what they're currently busy with. And we show the initiatives, the work the initiatives are doing. And we put that next to each other. Ideally, we of course wanted to have an energy agora talks, which unfortunately couldn't happen because of COVID. So eventually we had to restrict that to online sessions. And then we had a second edition where we made then also tables. So we sort of put all the, so these are sort of colored blocks where people can take the information home with them. And we look at the different roles. People can take the financing models, the policies, and we made that more expressive so that it becomes better understood. So this is just one of those working sessions. And the outcome of the working session was basically that the biggest question in the room is basically the idea of management. How do we manage such systems and how do we manage that as a commons, and what are examples? We also talked about the housing cooperatives in Zurich that can become examples how to manage such a system, how we could become owner without, while being a renter actually. So we have kind of 7 minutes left. And I'm gonna take that to show you a couple of other projects where we applied this methodology, and we are already a little bit further, and that are mostly related to water. So here you see the project Agua Carioca, that was a self-initiated, started as a self-initiated project in Rio de Janeiro, where we try to link exactly this idea of kind of a circular water treatment to see how much rain do we have in a location, how much wastewater is produced, how much space do we need to treat that wastewater, and where are the spaces to insert that in the neighborhoods. Analogous a little bit like you see the human metabolism, the lung or the kidney. And then we made plans for different neighborhoods, again on different scales, how that would actually become like a lung, where you get water from the forest, it flows through the neighborhood, through the houses, and it gets cleaned right there where it's produced to make sure the water then can be used for swimming, for instance. So we built here, this is, you see a pilot in the Sitio Roberto Burle Marx in Rio. And that we realized is extremely important because, for instance, this tool of constructed wetlands, many people think it's a pool or it's standing water. So the opinions really vary and go far apart. And when you have something that's actually built, it becomes built evidence. It's then also something to test what doesn't work, which is very, very big and manifold, which you see in the next project. I have to go a little faster. So this is a city of 1,000 tanks that also Nasle mentioned in the introduction, where we work with a very large, very diverse team of entities from social, cultural, the Goethe Institute to the TU Delft, for instance, with the Dutch government, and where we again try to see how can we turn the city from a linear model into a contained model that deals with water. Chennai has massive problems. You might have heard they had day zero. They had to bring in water with trains from far away. So to actually how to make water accessible is the most important question, but also flooding is very, very frequent because they have monsoons. So we looked then also back in history, how was water dealt with? And here you see a comparison of the model right now, where essentially the city cannot absorb any water because 70% is sealed, to a model that introduces nature-based solutions, so treatment systems within, and can lead to an abundance. And then in terms of systemic methodology, you see then here a number of nature-based solutions that then are applied to specific locations that then feed into a programmatic level on a city level. So we look then at operational models, and we look at replication sites to make sure this can land on the bigger city, and the efforts that we put in the beginning will not be lost because you show the potential for scale up. So right now, this is where we are in Chennai. This is a pilot project for a school of visually and hearing impaired children. And it looks very innocent on the picture, but we actually completely in the mud and in the repairs. And it's very, very interesting what we find, what is the sort of, what are the difficulties to overcome to make a performative pilot that actually does what we wanted to do and what we promised to do. So that goes from water chemistry to the system repairs, to communication, to actually engagement of the users. And so that is another visualization in time that shows how the work in the beginning, field trials where we are right now and feasibility phase, can eventually lead and inform flagship projects also on a cost level, for instance, but on a performance level, on a engagement tools level. Yeah, so that's it. So it's, I don't know if we have. Yeah, I can continue for like 3 minutes, maybe. Yeah. So that I would like to end with this project because it's a current project. It's called the Future Island. So in our practice, we also do projects that are basically in the art. We do art installations. We work together with an artist, Majtica Potric, and then we develop together kind of with a carte blanche, mostly together with curators and a location, a work. And so this is in Sweden, in Stockholm. It's situated in a university campus, a new university campus that's currently being built. And it will be our first permanent work. It's actually there for 100 years. And then, because normally we do temporary works, and then you think, oh my God, for 100 years, that's beyond all our lifetime, most probably. And we found basically granite rocks. That's the material that's present there. And we came up with the idea to make a new island made from these granite rocks, where half of the island is actually heated so you see here, the island has the hot side and a cold side, or a normal side. And that's why it's called Future Island. So we heat it to 5 degrees, whatever is the temperature of the environment. And it so becomes a conversation piece with work that scientists do, passers-by, students. And we can see, of course, snow melts earlier, but we will also see how species behave as they travel through the island. We will plant the same thing everywhere. So that's just some impressions from the building site. So all these rocks were basically put aside for us during the excavation. We brought them back, and we now, as it were, we sort of reconstructing nature in a different form. And that is more difficult than it might look, because of course these rocks are round, and so you have to learn how to build with round stones. You have to choose which stone goes where, which character of rock do we see where. Then we drilled those rocks in order to insert heating pipes. So we have 2 types of heating system, one underground and one with those heating pipes. And so, yeah, it's this kind of massive field that is very, very intriguing, and very, it's a kind of it's a completely different entity than the university that's built next to it. We showed this project invited by the Venice Biennial. And with that, I want to end. So you see here a prototype of the rock in the Biennale, and you see behind, you see a temperature timeline of planet Earth. And in this temperature timeline, we see the 15 degrees line in the middle. So that's where you see all the different globes. And it's a logarithmic timeline. So that means it's faster the further we go back in history. And we see here that all the granite, for instance, that we use for the island dates back to almost 2 billion years ago. But we also see that Earth was considerably hotter than it is right now. But that is, of course, before human beings were around. And we also see when we made sort of different snapshots of Earth at different times with different stories. And then you see that kind of you extract, so a stone dates back to that time. We also see that the carbon cycle, oxygen, carbon, the different elements played a large role, mostly driven by volcanoes. So most of those climate crises were up to 96% of species died. So we went through that already 5 times. Led to new types of species. So for instance, mammals, then we have human species. And so that is maybe where we can go back to the beginning. What is nature? And how do we insert ourselves within the cycles of nature, where we see here that we're burning things since 250,000 years on a daily basis, but actually planet Earth has used photosynthesis since 2.5 billion years. So somehow you might think that actually burning things is incredibly unsmart and a very bad use of the resource. And now, to illustrate capacity, I have these little black balls here, which is a drop. It's a lakritz, and we have to show it. Okay, so we have to show it. Milica, maybe you show it. Yeah. So one of those balls, Nasli, if you take out one of those balls, so one of those balls is actually what planet Earth, the amount of oil planet Earth can produce for each of us. You can eat them. It's lakritz. Yeah, it's sweet. It's sugar. It's not oil. And so that's, in fact, the amount of oil planet Earth produces for 8 billion people in 1 year. And so that is equivalent, if we go back to the, to the screen. Yeah. So that is basically equivalent to 18-meter driving, or 1 plastic bag. And so that is, let's say, when you make it personal, it becomes very clear what it is and how scarce it is and how we deal with it. Yeah, that's kind of nice ending. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Eva. Great. So I want to just reiterate. So we have maybe a few minutes for discussion. 10, 15 minutes. We have our Zoom screen shared on the projection screen in the auditorium. We'll try to take the questions from the Zoom audience as well, and the comments. So just to start the discussion, thank you for the candy, a Dutch experience. So so basically you have shown that let's say an average urban neighborhood in Rotterdam, and I think we are talking about the densities that are common in Zurich approximately as well. So we can achieve approximately 50% of a kind of self-sufficiency in terms of electricity production, and the heating needs can be fully covered.
Yeah.
Right. So that's so those were come a little bit to the camera. Yeah. So those I guess that's the for this amount the bills would be reduced as well, right?
Sure, I forgot to say that. In fact, the bills would be reduced. We also went to a bank. We went to the bank, Nederlandse Gemeenschap, and we wanted to see can you get a loan for something like this? And they actually, for this case one, they said you can get a loan if the municipality would be the guarantor for 30 years. And then you could actually build it. You could actually get the money back with the monthly fees that people pay. That would be smaller than it was 2 years ago. And if that would have been done, we would have already saved 400,000 euros with the rise in energy costs now. So compared to an investment of 10 million, that's quite large, let's say. And so in order to, I know it sounds kind of scary to make these numbers, but somehow you need to do it. If we don't talk about economy, then we kind of lose the battle somehow.
And so I'm curious where what is the reception among the residents when you discuss this kind of possibility, let's say a massive social organizing, the kind of trainings in, kind of cooperative work, kind of alignment of everybody's interests, to transform the neighborhood in this kind of, to rewire essentially the whole kind of urban, let's say, metabolism, doing interventions on homes, etc., etc. I mean, so my first question is about the residents, then about the government, and then about, I'm curious to somehow unpack, do you see specific kind of obstacles or issues, or how do we sort of put such massive projects in motion, let's say?
So I see. So to start with the people in the neighborhood, on the one hand, they have a great interest to do that, but of course they don't have the investment capacity at first. Also, the project is not exactly there, like there is a sort of step missing that would need to be commissioned. And they, because right now the city is rolling out the heat network, high temperature heat network, and residents are very worried about the costs. They also worried about gentrification. So that's something else that basically also blue-green infrastructure, when that comes into a neighborhood, usually the prices raise and becomes more attractive, means people have to leave. So how could we counter that mechanism? That's would need to be addressed. Now for the municipality, also the municipality, they have civil servants, they have their jobs. How sustainability is integrated within, that's still not, let's say, done in a very, very efficient way, because it's not in every department. It's a sort of, there's a specific sustainability department. And so they get a new project on their lap, so to speak. And so they get work to do, which they haven't been paid for. So somebody who would actually be there specifically to address this in another way, that job doesn't exist right now. So you need somebody very, very idealistic to do that. And it is also, let's say, scary for the municipality. So with the Biennale, we had one incident where we actually got an interest from a journalist from NRC, Nederlandse Handelsblad. They published the story, in fact, that the neighborhood can be 100% heat independent, 50% energy independent. Immediately, the gemeente, the municipality, phoned the Biennale and said, "What are you doing?" Really, like this. You're going against our plans. That was not the deal.
Right. And what are their plans?
Their plans are to roll out this heat network, which is run by Eneco. So Eneco is one of those large companies. They're owned by Mitsubishi. All their profits go to Japan, essentially. And they have the concession until 2045. So concessions are another obstacle that we have to deal with. So concessions for heat, especially, I mean, you have a so-called Warmtewet, so that is a law for heat. So if you more than, I think, 300 households, you're not allowed to become competitive. So actually networks have to stay smaller in order to be competitive. So it's a kind of jungle out there that these things you can only talk about when you have such a project, and then you kind of link it. But on the other hand, we have energy providers, Vattenfall. They also know they won't be able to achieve 100%. So they know we must look for some other addition elsewhere, because we won't achieve this transition in the amount of time. So they kind of also interested to see how they can tap this capacity.
So many interesting questions can be raised. I mean, the urban design level sort of I mean, by the nature of its subject, right? So you're dealing with the residents and you're looking to empower the residents, and you're you know, you are working in a way for the community, right? But let's say the role of this sort of you know, companies, corporations, various levels of governments who I would say even banks, I mean, who have so far, you know, and on whose goodwill essentially the success of such project would depend, you know, is also crucial, right? And I wonder, you know, to what extent, I mean, as you described with the phone call, right? So in a way, those you know, we come to the point where you know, where I think this discussion now becomes interesting, right? So who should be empowered, right? And I think probably I mean, government would be a kind of an interesting ally, a possible ally who would, who could, I mean, who basically will tip the scale in a certain direction, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, is it, do you find the discussion in the Netherlands, I think, somehow asking the right questions? I mean, do you see that, where is your work, to say so, in the kind of wider, let's say, politics of energy? You know,
yeah, we see,
as you read it right now, let's say, in the,
I mean, in the last month, I mean, of course, now with the crisis, that always happens when you're in a crisis, the discussion is warming up towards other solutions as the urgency becomes clearer. Even the summer was much worse, much hotter, so the climate crisis becomes more tangible as well. And for instance, you have a municipality of Amsterdam that we talk to. They work with the donut model of Kate Raworth, and so they are naturally more, they have more affinity maybe than the municipality of Rotterdam right now, to go into talks of how you could strategize this and where you could start. So that's one end, of course, to work with municipalities. The other end is also to link to, we now we co-lectured with the Commons network in Amsterdam, which also have a good network of initiatives. And so we're trying to basically find links of interested entities that have a certain level of social consciousness, environmental consciousness, idealism, to try and kick off something, an alternative, essentially.
Good. So I'm looking at the time. So I would say we have probably a possibility for a couple of questions or comments from the audience. Nazli, you will let us know if there are any. Hey, okay, great. Come down. Take the mic and stand here in front of the camera, so you are engaging with the Zoom audience.
It's a very short question, actually, about the beginning of your presentation. You were talking about a circular flow model, and I wanted to ask, like, if you could explain that a bit more.
The circular flow model. So circular flow, it yeah. So I have someone to talk to. So circular flow means all processes on Earth are by definition circular. No, you have night and day. It's repeating, And so within that, you have slight differences. And so that enables certain processes. We have winter, summer, the Earth is rotating around the sun. So it is all circular processes. And so we have to think, so it rains, water falls down, it gets absorbed by the Earth, it evaporates, plants grow, new rain falls. So where in this kind of cycle do we insert ourselves, and how do we give water back the same way we received it, which is clean? And how do we use energy without producing waste? Because in this sort of cycle, the concept of waste simply doesn't exist. On a planetary level, there is no waste. It's basically stays within the system always. And so right now, the waste is creating this carbon, CO2, or a greenhouse gas, also methane, this greenhouse gas layer, and that creates trouble in the house, basically. And so this idea of so giving it back as you got it, and that is the idea of the circular flow, so that we as humans, as other species, it passes through us, but we not becoming, let's say, an obstacle or a kind of something to be eliminated, essentially.
Thanks a lot.
Good question, yeah.
Nazli? Okay, you are in front of the camera, right?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I can also turn it. Thanks, Eva, for the wonderful lecture. I found it very interesting that you started with this idea of what is nature, and then later you ask what is nature's value, and which leads to this question of what are our values and these value systems. And you were also mentioning when you go to this neighborhood level, people are becoming very critical about this concept of energy transition, and they think it's something the government is inventing, etc. So my question would be then, I mean, you also mentioned that it's not a technical problem. You said it's a societal and cultural problem, and we need to get everyone on board. And this always brings this double-sided sword where how do we get everyone on board and change these value systems? But then is this enough? Because then there are the oil and gas titans that are kind of also branding themselves as energy companies, which is in itself like also very problematic. But what is maybe your take on what is most I don't know, optimum, that it's something that is coming from bottom up, but also that there is some sort of from change in governments or these industries, etc., that actually make that leap also, so that we actually go through this energy transition, because it's, I guess, not really enough if we are doing that in that very small scale. But that is kind of maybe the beginning of some sort of a hope or transition, because yesterday we were also talking about this. You were at our midterm review, this idea of activism and when it becomes activism, etc. So I'm just wondering how do we cope with that idea that it's these titans that are actually making the most, emissions, etc., etc. What do you think about that?
Sorry, it's the what? It's the
these energy giants. I mean, these kind of companies.
The Royal Dutch Shell in the whole story. Let's talk about it.
That's the one slide I kicked out, but okay. So I think we have to basically learn what happened in the past, and we basically trusted these companies. I don't know if any of you saw the BBC documentary series Big Oil. It's a must. It's an absolute must, because basically it goes from the beginning, from the 70s even, where the big giants actually commissioned scientists to do research into the implications on climate. They found there is a big implication. They talked before US government eventually. And it's very interesting how it goes from a sort of, even in George W. Bush Senior, it was still, even Republicans were working on climate. When Jimmy Carter lost the election, in his budget, he was planning until 2000, the year 2000, 20% of renewable energy. So up until the moment was all sort of going reasonably fine. There was not, like climate change was not a fake news. It was a kind of agreed by everybody. And then what happened in the year 2000 is when, I think it's when Al Gore lost the election, right? And George W. Bush Jr. got elected. And that's when the big giants, they wrote a letter to the US government and said, this is impossible, you have to stop this. And that's when they basically geared up all their lobbying towards stopping the climate movement. And that was when the Republicans essentially turned anti-climate. And then that whole sort of idea started of something that's a climate being Democrat, and that influenced all of us, the whole planet. And so that's where we have to see, we have to return it. In what way? We have to stop believing them, and we have to spread the message, because it's also a fragility that comes with being dependent on very few large companies. And that's where different professions also, amongst them us as urbanists, have to step in. I don't see any other way.
Is there another question?
I can read it.
Okay, we will take one more question, and then we are moving to the exercise. We have to finish on time.
Mm-hmm. So the question is about the neighborhood project in Rotterdam, and asking if you think it's something similar is possible in less developed countries.
In less developed countries. I think in less developed countries, it might be much more easy actually to achieve that. That's our experience from Brazil, and also for India, where we're working on that project where you saw the pilot. We're working on that 4 years. In Brazil, it took, I think, 3 years until we built the pilot. So let's say the speed and the way of making decisions is usually much faster in less developed countries. We are kind of surrounded by this stiff net of bureaucracy. And you have, I have met people, but also in Bosporus-Tussendijk, I have met people who say, okay, let's start tomorrow. So it's a kind of discrepancy between people who say, I'm ready, let's start, and other processes that take a long time to be agreed, and where then basically you 3 years further suddenly. But when you look at the Paris Agreement, 3 years mean a lot. So I think there is a lot of improvement to be made there by politicians, like, for instance, in New Zealand, Jacinta Ardern, she gave us this example of saying, it will be in my legislation we're gonna make this achievement, and not in somebody else's legislation in 30 years' time.
Great. So now exercise. Nazli will introduce it. Brought this for you, Eva, that essentially to clarify that we do exercises with the guests, right? So that the students already know that we've been doing this for several years back. There are 3 graded exercises, and they are conceived or inspired by or sort of, you know, directly relying on the tools that our guests are working with. So we are looking at a cartographic exercise outlined by Filip Rekačević, who is he described it as experimental and affective cartography, or this was my Earth that was described as a kind of an anamorphosis of the Earth in order to raise awareness of the let's say Earth as a kind of finite environment, you know. So the atmosphere is presented in the middle, and so it's a sort of Earth like inverted, like a rubber ball. So that was, for instance, a wonderful exercise. Or with Feifei Zhou of one of the co-authors of Feral Atlas, this kind of panoramas that are in fact also historical narratives of certain processes that you read from left to right, and so on. So each one was in a way a kind of representational exercise, but also exploring a particular topic that pertaining to the lecture series. We also do that, of course, in order to involve the guest in the process of evaluation, to open up the kind of let's say criteria, and to destabilize, let's say, the kind of a frontal model of knowledge transmission, obviously. So we collect those exercises very meticulously, and they are unique, and they are presented in these unique book objects, as we call them. And we are working toward the exhibition sometime in the next couple of years. We will show. So it's a kind of a unique documentation of what a very large section of each generation has to say about urgent topics, let's say, in our society. So thanks very much for that. So we will share the exercise with Eva, and she will return her comments, and we will lay them out for you in a last session called Our Common Territories. So Nazle, please introduce our exercise inspired by Eva's work titled My Energy Personality.
So now we are with the last exercise, My Energy Personality, a daily calibration. And I would like to go back with this exercise to one climate fiction book that I already mentioned last time. It's a series called Carbon Diaries, written by a high school teacher from London. And it's a series of young adult novels, which will soon be made into a BBC series, actually. And this coming of age story centered around Laura Brown, the 16-year-old protagonist, is about climate change and energy crisis. It takes place in the UK after an environmental catastrophe where power becomes very scarce and the government begins carbon rationing. The story is told in diary form by Laura, the protagonist, as a teenager living in London and going through all this usual teenage stuff, but in the aftermath of this great storm, which changes their daily life completely. So everyone has a carbon allowance. You basically get some sort of a card with points on it, and every time you do something power related, your points are deduced, it's deducted. And this is kind of like a harsh environment. Each citizen has this sort of like decisions that they have to make in like activating which appliances that they use at home, or should they take the bus, take an airplane, etc., because everything just becomes super expensive or hard. And again, I would like to read the short passage, which says from Laura's words, "The worst thing is, on top of all this, me and Kim have to give up loads of our points for the family energy allowance, which leaves us some pathetic amount for travel, college, going out. the car's gonna be cut way back. All of us get access to PC, TV, HD, stereo for only 2 hours a day. Heating is down to 16 degrees in the living room and 1 hour a day for the rest of the house. Showers max 5 minutes, baths only at weekend. You've got to choose hair dryer, toaster, microwave, smartphone, deionizer, mom, kettle, lights, PDA, ePod, fridge or freezer, and on and on. Flights are a real no-no, and shopping, traveling, and going out not much better. It's all kind of a choice. So this is a passage from her diary, which also brings us to this kind of our everyday lives. We are receiving these weekly emails about how our institutions are coping with the energy crisis and what we can do about it. We see daily on billboards, read on news, and hear people talking about the same subject, and we talk about it ourselves all the time. And this brings us to our exercise, which we will ask you to calculate and represent how much energy you spent in a day, in one day. So initially, we would like to ask you to think about how you actually spent a typical day. What kind of devices or home appliances do you use? How much is your daily life dependent on energy consumption? For example, what do you do when you wake up? Do you check your smartphone immediately, or do you go to the coffee machine? And what do you do during the day? Do you cook on an electric stove or work on your laptop, ride your e-bike? And then what do you do in the evening? Of course, do you turn on the lights, make a tea, boil the kettle, use the hair dryer, etc. So after this kind of thought exercise, where maybe you start by like taking notes and doing some small sketches, we ask you to find a simple energy meter. You can, of course, purchase one and share it amongst each other in turns, or borrow one from our chair, which we will have some like around 10 next week. And I will write you the information about that later. And then you will use this gadget to measure how much energy you consume in a day. You can choose up to 5 everyday devices that you use the most, like smartphone, hair dryer, kettle, coffee machine, heater, etc., and calculate how much total power is consumed while you're actively using each of these devices. And you will record how much energy each device separately consumes, and then make a total calculation of the whole day. And at the end of your assessment, the idea is to represent your energy consumption in a drawing, which should include several sketches of kind of like these devices that you use throughout the day, which gives an information on your daily behavior, and kind of like a metabolic diagram that shows kind of this overall how it relates to the total amount of energy that you use. And so for, let's say, we can also think about how you represent this amount, the total power that you use. You could also try to represent it in sort of like a, you would need this amount of this fraction of a solar panel to actually produce that, what you use, what you consume in one day, etc. And based on this assessment, which reveals certain daily behavior about yourself and your personal energy consumption, we will also ask you to describe your energy personality, which also should relate to your title in a very short text. So then it comes, are you like a smartphone addict, or are you like a water boiler? Are you like a binge watcher on your laptop, or are you a night owl which works with lights on, etc.? So this is kind of the idea. And there are some inspirations, and I think we will also send you more later from all these things which we saw today, like these beautiful drawings from Eva. This is also one of their work. Yeah, these were also the readings Sure. Yes.
Just one aspect that's interesting with my energy personality. So it's not called my electricity personality, but it's called my energy personality. So I think to overlay it with your level of energy, that would be good. So if you see when your battery goes down and when your battery is fully recharged, to kind of maybe monitor that in parallel and try to visualize it as well, overlay it with the work. Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think we stress the kind of this perhaps to a certain kind of taking inspiration from Eva's sort of explorations of circularity through diagrams. But I think you can take it. Let's say, feel free to take it in a direction that you like. I mean, with the energy meters, I think the note is perhaps we limit to 5 devices, so to make it possible. You know, obviously everybody use more than 5 devices in a day, but you know, suggestion is to limit yourself to those that you use most, because to make it sort of doable, and try to do it in one day, you know, so to give a kind of estimate of your energy use, and perhaps to compare yourself with a sort of possible source or of let's say produced energy, right? So like, where could this energy come from, or where would you like it to come from, and so on. So you can present these types of explorations. So that's great. So I think we are getting ready to finish the session with the readings, and
Yes, maybe it might be also good to go back to Eva's readings, and also for the next session, which will be our last guest lecture. I think it's also, it would be very interesting in ideas of thinking about energy as a created and invented theme, let's say, and going back to its historiography and all these kind of relational things that it has with other themes that we are discussing. So thank you, everyone here and also on Zoom. And thank you to Eva.
yeah.
Okay, this is it.